Ao thought surviving Seoul had been the test. She was wrong. Surviving was just the entrance fee. What waited for her on the other side of that boardroom door was a different game entirely. One where the players didn't leak fake emails at midnight. They simply made sure you were never in the room when the real decisions got made. Her grandmother had given her half a story about the spider who wins, and half a story about the spider who nearly loses himself doing it. There was a third half nobody had told her yet. What the spider does once the web is finally his. This is that story. The partner floor didn't look like the rest of the building. Quieter. Older wood instead of glass. The kind of hush that came from money that no longer needed to prove itself. Ao walked the length of the hallway counting her own footsteps, certain she was about to be disciplined for something. The email, the confrontation with Soo-jin, some version of the story that had reached the wrong ears and been reshaped along the way stories always were once enough people had held them. She sat across from three people whose names she'd only ever seen at the bottom of firm-wide memos, never spoken aloud in a room she was standing in. A woman near the head of the table introduced herself as Director Han and slid a folder across the polished wood without ceremony. We run an accelerated leadership track. 6 associates a year, firm-wide, hand-selected. I asked for you personally after the Huang file crossed my desk. Ao didn't reach for the folder immediately. Her hands stayed in her lap, steadier than she felt. Why me? I'm still technically an intern. Because you solved a liability problem nobody else on that account caught in time, Han said. And then, months later, you owned a mistake in front of the entire team that nobody would ever have traced back to you. Her expression didn't soften exactly, but it sharpened into something closer to respect than scrutiny. Cleverness is common on this floor, Ms. Adeyemi. Cleverness paired with honesty is not. That combination is rarer than talent and considerably harder to teach. Ao thought, unbidden, of the Ankara bracelet still tied at her wrist, worn soft now from months of wear. She reached for the folder. Minjun had been groomed for this floor since business school. The right professors, the right internships, a partner father figure who'd never once had to explain himself to anyone in his life, and a resume built by people who'd cleared the path before he ever had to walk it. When Ao was assigned as his co-lead on a 9-figure account, he crossed the conference room to shake her hand with a smile that never once touched his eyes. I've heard about you, he said, pleasant as a closed door. The intern who fixed Huang. I've heard about you too, Ao said, matching his tone exactly. The one who's never had to fix anything himself. He laughed like the line hadn't landed. It had landed, and they both knew it. What followed wasn't loud enough to name, and that was precisely the point. A strategy meeting rescheduled without her notification, discovered only after the fact. A shared file accidentally left off her access list for 2 critical days. A client call she was meant to lead, quietly reassigned to him the morning of, framed as a favor to spare her the workload. Nothing she could point to on its own. Only a pattern, forming slowly, every thread of it deniable in isolation. Soo-jin's old trick, back in part 1, had been a blunt instrument, an email anyone could trace with enough patience. This was something else entirely. This was a scalpel, held by someone who'd been trained his whole life to apply exactly enough pressure to draw blood without ever leaving a mark anyone else could see. He's not going to email anyone at midnight, Soo-jin said, closing Ao's office door behind her without being asked. 8 months since the Huang crisis, and Soo-jin's precision had turned from a weapon aimed at Ao into something closer to armor she now wore on Ao's behalf. Minjun's father built half this floor's alliances before Minjun could legally drink. You don't beat that kind of inheritance with evidence, because there's nothing on paper to find. You beat it by understanding who owes whom in this building, and quietly making sure enough of them start owing you instead. That sounds exactly like the game I promised myself I was finished playing. It's not a game if you play it honestly, Soo-jin said, sitting down across from her without waiting to be invited. It's just how power actually moves in a building like this one. Who trusts whom, who covers for whom, who remembers a favor 5 years later. I should have told you all of this on your very first day, instead of spending that day testing you the way I did. Ao studied her for a long moment. It was the closest thing to an apology Soo-jin had ever offered her, wrapped inside advice instead of spoken plainly, which was somehow exactly like her. "Thank you," Ao said, and meant both parts of it. "Don't thank me yet," Soo-jin said, already standing to leave. "Thank me after you've survived using it." Ao took the advice with her into every meeting for the rest of that week, turning it over the way her grandmother once turned over an old story, looking for the parts she'd missed the first time she'd heard it. If you caught part 1 and wondered whether Soo-jin would stay a rival or become something else, this is your answer. Subscribe if you want to see where her loyalty actually gets tested. She started winning, using Soo-jin's advice the way it was meant to be used, quietly, honestly, one earned favor at a time. Client meetings that used to exclude her started needing her in the room, and needing her specifically, not just her seat. But winning at this altitude cost differently than it had as an intern living on ambition and instant noodles. Jae-won mentioned it carefully, the way he mentioned everything, never accusing. Just that she'd canceled dinner 4 times in 3 weeks, and that he'd started making reservations he half expected to cancel before she even called. She caught herself, once, quietly calculating what a colleague's messy divorce might mean for an upcoming account reassignment, running the angles almost before she noticed she was doing it, the old reflex, dormant since the email disaster in part 1, twitching back awake somewhere behind her ribs. She sat with that feeling longer than she wanted to admit. "You're doing the thing," Soo-jin told her bluntly. Over coffee neither of them had time to be drinking. "The thing you swore off in front of the whole team, if I remember correctly." "I'm surviving a level you never had to survive," Ao said, sharper than she meant to. "I know exactly what level this is," Soo-jin said, not flinching. "I watched what surviving it did to me for 6 years before you ever walked onto this floor. I'm not warning you because I think you're weak. I'm warning you because I know precisely how this ends if nobody says it out loud." Ao didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure yet whether she wanted one. Minjun's campaign finally surfaced where people could actually see it, which was somehow worse than the months of deniable pressure that came before. An internal report, leaked to 3 department heads under someone else's name, quietly questioning whether AO's rapid rise reflected merit or simply the firm's optics needs in a year when diversity numbers were under scrutiny. A client dinner she learned about only because Soo-jin, sitting inside it, texted her a photo with no caption at all. The message was clear without one. Whispers in the break room died the moment she walked in, the exact silence she remembered from her very first week on this floor. Except this time it wasn't strangers measuring an outsider. It was people who'd watched her earn every inch of this floor for over a year, now quietly recalculating whether that earning had been real. She stood alone in the elevator afterward, watching her own reflection warp slightly in the brushed steel doors, and for a moment genuinely didn't recognize the tightness in her own jaw. Her grandmother's spider had won, once, by staying 3 moves ahead of creatures who underestimated him. Nobody had warned her what it felt like when the game stopped being about winning cleverly and started being about survival at a scale that could actually end a career. Quietly, permanently, without anyone ever having to raise their voice or leave a single trace behind them. She pressed the button for her floor twice, though it changed nothing, and rode the rest of the way down in silence. The information landed in her inbox from a source she never confirmed and never went looking for, real proof, that Minjun had falsified a client projection to win the account that started all of this in the first place. One email, forwarded to the right 3 people on this floor, and his entire career was finished by the end of the week. Nobody would ever trace it back to her. It would look exactly like what it technically was. Consequences, not sabotage, the kind of ending everyone on the partner floor would quietly agree he'd earned himself. Her cursor hovered over forward for longer than she wanted to admit to anyone, even herself. She thought about the email that had nearly ended her own career in part 1, sent under her name by someone who decided the ends justified whatever means were available. She thought about how certain Soo-jin had looked doing it, how righteous, right up until it hadn't worked. She thought, finally, about her grandmother's voice, worn smooth from repetition. He became so certain of his own cleverness that he stopped checking whether he was right, only whether he could win. She didn't forward it. She saved it instead, unopened by anyone else, in a folder she would never look at again, and sat alone in the quiet of an office nobody else was in, holding the full weight of a decision nobody would ever know she'd made. Not Min-jun, not Director Han, not even her grandmother, unless Ao chose to tell her herself. She flew home for a week, the first real break she'd taken in over a year. Her grandmother Freilia, now than the last visit. The years showing in Wei's phone calls had never let Ao see clearly, but sharper than ever, sitting in the exact same doorway she'd sent Ao off from years before with a bracelet and half a story. Ao told her everything this time, holding nothing back. Min-jun, the email she'd chosen not to send, the nights lately when she hadn't recognized her own reflection in an elevator's brushed steel doors. Her grandmother listened without interrupting once, then nodded slowly, the way she did when a decision had already settled somewhere behind her eyes. There is a third part to Anansi's story. I did not think you were ready to hear it before, when you first left this house. Tell me now, Ao said. I think I finally am. When Anansi finally became ruler of his own web, the other animals waited for him to turn tyrant, the way clever men so often do once nobody left standing can stop them. Her grandmother's grip on Ao's hand tightened, gentle but certain. He surprised every one of them. He spent his power building bridges across the web for the smallest creatures, the ones who could never have spun a single thread strong enough to cross it alone. She held Ao's gaze the way she had the very first night of this whole story. Power was never meant to be the ending, my dear. It was only ever the beginning of a better question. What will you build with it, now that it's finally yours to spend? This is the line the whole story has been building toward. If it's hitting you the way it hit me writing it, that's exactly what this channel is for. Stick around for the ending. Ao didn't destroy Min-jun with the email she'd saved and never sent. She built a case instead, quiet, procedural, undeniable, assembled over weeks from documents that could stand entirely on their own, and brought it to Director Han through the proper channel, in daylight, with her name attached to every page of it. Soo-jin and Jae-won both stood behind her account of the campaign that had been run against her, willing to say plainly what they'd each witnessed. It took 3 weeks to move through the proper process. It cost her nothing she couldn't afford to lose, because this time she'd won it the way her grandmother's second story had asked her to, building a bridge instead of setting a trap, and trusting the bridge would hold weight on its own. Min-jun was quietly moved off the partner track before the quarter ended, the kind of quiet that spoke louder on this floor than any public reckoning could have. Ao was made the youngest director in the firm's history 6 months later, in the very same boardroom where Director Han had first slid a folder across the table and asked her to reach for it. You did it differently than I expected you would, given everything I'd read about you, Han told her afterward, studying her with something that had shifted, again, from scrutiny toward something warmer. I did it the way I should have done it the first time, Ao said simply, back when I still thought winning was the whole point. 5 years later, Ao stood in front of a wall of cameras. No longer the nervous intern who'd once eaten instant noodles alone at 9 p.m. and called it dinner, but the head of one of Seoul's most respected firms, a name that appeared in business pages on 2 continents now, spoken by people who'd never once had to prove themselves the way she had. Beside the podium, a banner in bold gold lettering read, "The Anansi Fellowship." "This isn't charity," she told the room, her voice steadier than it had ever been in that first boardroom years ago. "This is a door. I had to trick my way through a door that should have simply been standing open for someone like me from the very beginning. I'm not interested in raising another generation of clever survivors who have to out-scheme their way into rooms they've already earned. I'm interested in making sure the next girl from a place like mine never needs to be that clever just to be seen." Jae-won watched from the front row, the same soft, unhurried patience in his face as that first night with the noodles, years and an entire lifetime ago. Soo-jin stood near the back of the room, arms crossed loosely, something unmistakably like pride written across a face that had once measured Ao for a threat instead of a friend. Ao called her grandmother that night, phone propped against a stack of fellowship applications. "Tell me about the first one," her grandmother said. "The girl you're choosing." "Grandma," Ao laughed, "there are 400 applications." "Good," her grandmother said. "That means the door is working. If you started this journey back in part one wondering whether a stranger in Seoul could really build something this big, she did, and now you know how the whole story ends. If it moved you even a little, that's worth a like before you go. Which part of Ao's journey hit you hardest? Tell me below.